And it looks like we are live. Let's see if anybody is here. As always, especially given that I had some sound issues last week, let's do a sound check. Let's make sure you guys can hear me. And once we get that out of the way, we'll go ahead and get going. I do apologize if I sound winded. There is a good reason for it. I was trying to get my office up and running. All right, Mr. Ball Infinity can hear me, and presumably you can see me. So we'll roll with it. All righty. We've got a couple of people here. Okay. The topic of the conversation today, once I get moving with it, I'll give it a couple of minutes. The topic of the conversation today will be, again, electro-optics. I've been sort of leaning toward that lately in an attempt to get a reasonable coverage of the core of how this stuff works. I talked about night vision last week. We're going to go back to thermal today. Rather than just bore you with lots of technical stuff, I figured a good way to talk about it is to focus on a particular brand, talk about a couple of their products, and as applicable to transition into a conversation about how clip-ons work. I've had a lot of questions about clip-ons. A lot of people were saying how hard it is to collimate a clip-on. So I want to talk a little bit about what all that means. How these things are often set up, what collimation really means, and what is important. There's a topic that needs to be covered. People who have been using clip-ons, who usually come from the side of a night vision image intensifier clip-ons, talk often about something called prisms, using prisms to collimate clip-ons. They're called Risley prisms. I'll talk a little bit about that and try to explain that this is one of the difference between digital and analog clip-ons. For a digital one, you don't, strictly speaking, need prisms, and they are, for thermals, for the most part, there are exceptions to it. We'll talk about it, an unnecessary complication. For example, I have within the reach of me 3 different thermal clip-ons. None of them use steering prisms, Risley prisms, and there is a reason for it. That would just be adding to the cost. One other thing. So as I was trying to clean up my office, and you guys, it's a good thing you guys can't see what's around me. It is spectacularly messy, even by my standards. And my standards for messy are very, very high, I'll be honest with you. So as I was cleaning up, I discovered a while back I made a batch of Zippo lighters with my Dark Lord of Optics logos, and so I found one. I thought I gave them all away, but I found one. Let me see if I can actually figure out where I put it. But I know it is here somewhere, since I saw it fairly recently. All I'm seeing here is approximately 1,100 different rifle scopes and no lighters. Anyhow, it is here somewhere. I know it's here. I saw it. It's a black Zippo with my logo. And since I have discovered one of those, I'm going to go ahead and say, if you can figure out what's in this glass with a reasonable accuracy, or at least whoever gets closest, I'm going to send you a lighter. We'll figure out who got closest. Send me an email at swag@darklordofoptics.com, and I'll send you a Zippo lighter with the Dark Lord of Optics logo. Okay. I'll keep this banner up for a little bit. All right, and Doug is here. Hi, Doug. Cheers, gentlemen. It is very good. No soup for you, for those who have watched Seinfeld. Mr. Brooks Precision. All right, where was I? Oh, yeah, thermals. So let's see. I've got enough people. We're about 5 minutes into it. So let's start a conversation about thermals. How do thermals work? I'm going to spend about 3 minutes on that. I'm back to using a blackboard since I kind of like these things anyway. And let's see if it's a little bit more visible. A thermal rifle scope is essentially a camera and an eyepiece. And in between them, there's some sort of electronics, right? So heat is coming from here. There is a thermal camera. That means there's a thermal optic of some sort, usually made out of germanium. In here, there is an imaging core, something called the microbolometer, and I'll talk about that more in a moment, right? Here, there is all sorts of electronics. Here, there's a micro display, and there are some sort of optics here that project this visible information out. In many ways, the thermal rifle scope really is a wavelength converter, right? So you've got heat coming in and visible light coming out, right? How does the conversion happen? The imaging core here, the thermal image sensor, the microbolometer, captures heat, digitizes it. We get a digital image that gets massaged, adjusted, enhanced, whatever, in some way. And then there is a micro display here that spits it out. Both the micro display and the microbolometer and the image sensor have certain resolution assigned to them, right? The most typical resolutions for the microbolometer that's commercially available are VGA, which is 640 by 480 or 640 by 512 or something like that, and QVGA, which is approximately a quarter of that within reason. That's 320 by 240. The one I have here is 384 by 288. Okay, these are two most common resolutions for the microbolometer. For the output display here, the resolutions vary, right? And I've seen a lot of different ones, and I will explain why they matter. The very, very common one is 1024 by 768. There are some that's a little bit higher, 1300 something. There are some that exactly match the sensor. Okay. Envision does this. Envision does the same 640 by 512, I think. It's a little bit bigger. They move it around and stuff like that. But the most common is probably this. Let me pull up my Excel sheet where I had all this stuff recorded. Good questions. Can you cover thermals generations in a few words? Yeah, absolutely. Just give me a moment to pull up an Excel spreadsheet that talks about a variety of. I have tabulated basically the tech specs on a bunch of thermals that I've been looking at, and I want to. If I wasn't so late with everything, I would have had it open already, but I haven't. So you guys, I'm afraid, have to bear with me. And there we go. No, that's not it. How interesting. As always, when you're looking for something, it's going to be the last thing that pops up to you. All right, let's try this one more time. The reason I'm trying to pull it up is that I had resolutions of a bunch of different output displays. There we go. I found it, and there it is. Okay. So let me make it a little bit bigger, and I'm going to cast it on the screen. Yeah, that's another good question. What is the actual entry-level price for clip-ons? I'll cover that momentarily. So let's share the Excel file. There it is. All right, you should be able to see this. There is a bunch of stuff here. Notice the column called display resolution. Most of these have higher resolution than image sensors themselves, and there is a reason for it. So 1024 by 768 is the most common. There are a few that are a little bit higher as well, and there's stuff like NVision that actually matches the pixel by pixel the resolution of the image sensor that they use. I'll be bringing this up with reasonable regularity as we go along. Okay. I just want you to remember, since it's going to be useful for the future discussion, that the resolution of the output display in the imaging sensor in thermals is usually different, though not always, and there is a reason for it. Oh, that's a good question. iRay and Infrared, is it the same company? Sort of. So the semi-affordable thermals that we're seeing now are all exist because China managed to spin up with the manufacturing of thermal image sensors and imaging cores and thermal cameras to a really impressive degree. They kind of had to. They started all these projects for their own military because we obviously would not sell them the high-performing image sensors that we make. So most of the foreign thermal imaging industry sort of started because the United States wouldn't sell them the good stuff. Israelis had to do their own, French had to do their own, so did Germans, and so did the Chinese. And the way most of these Chinese manufacturers goes, or at least the first one, the biggest one, used to be the biggest, I don't know if it still is, called Guide Infrared. The way they started, they needed this for their missile seekers and whatever, top 1% performing. When you manufacture, there's always tolerances, there is some spread. Top 1% would go to for their own military means, maybe top 2%, and the rest they throw out in the commercial market at comparatively low prices, which is what really enabled this civilian thermal image sensor resolution. One of these companies is called the Raytron Tech, and their camera brand, their house brand, is called InfiRay. And for riflescope and such, the InfiRay's commercial brand is called iRay. It's all the same company, it's sort of different subdivisions of it. But iRay is one of the larger manufacturers of thermal imaging cores in China and presumably in the world. Okay. They now have a very robust US presence. They've slowly expanding their team. Their products are getting better focused, better configured, because they are doing a lot of support here. They kind of have to do a lot of support here, right? There is a thing with ITAR. ITAR stands for International Traffic in Arms Regulations. And there's a funky thing about ITAR is that you can ship all this thermal stuff here from China without any real issues. But if let's say something is broken and you want to send it back to China without an appropriate export license, you can't. And now it sounds funny. It was made in China and just got here. If you turn around, try to send it back, you'll either go to jail or pay serious fines. Theoretically, you can probably get an export license, but I don't know how easy it is, or if it's possible at all, to get an export license to send a thermal riflescope to China, no matter that it was made in China and just brought here 5 minutes ago. So iRay and all the other companies who do this kind of stuff, if they want to have their own presence in the United States, they have to have US offices that are set up to sell, market these things, but also probably maintain, repair, things like that, because sending stuff back to the factory is really pretty involved. Okay, good question. Pardon me. I can't just drink booze. Sometimes I have to drink water. It's approximately 8,000 degrees in Albuquerque this month, so I'm dry. Okay, it's an interesting question. What is the actual entry-level price for clip-ons? So entry-level price for usable, workable clip-ons, if let's say I want to go hog hunting, stuff like that, is around $3,000. And the two that I've tried in that price range that I would not hesitate to use, one is a Burris BTC50, and I've talked about it quite a lot. and like it a good bit. In DFW, it was 112 the other week. I know my office is in Dallas, so that's why I haven't gone there in a little bit. I mean, I like Texas and all, but not really in August all that much. But anyhow, so Burris, and there's a company called AccuFire, and they make an interesting product. I was going to do another video on it that can be used as a scope or as a clip-on. And that's also in the same roughly $3,000 range. Both Burris and AccuFire are this type of a 384 by 2. So Burris is 400 by 300 resolution. AccuFire, I think, is 320 by 240, and I should have it here somewhere. I kind of want to show you guys what it looks like. It's fairly similar, but yet a little different. So if I can figure out what I did with it quickly, I think this is it. Is this? Yes, it is. Amazing. I actually remembered something. There we go. So let's pull that out. Okay. So this is the AccuFire, I think Incendus is what it's called. I'll put a link. Yeah, AccuFire Incendus. I'll put the link in the video description. This one's kind of interesting. If you just look at the specs, it's nothing exceptional. When you actually use this thing, it is the sum of all parts is better than it looks on paper. I was kind of quietly impressed with this thing. So both of these are around $3,000, and both of these are quite usable. So I wouldn't hesitate too much. Well, in fact, I was talking with a Tau guy from Infrared on the phone today. They were thinking about possibly putting an office in my local city. I was explaining to them about inventory tax in Freeport areas. There we go. Infrared, interesting. I don't know that guy. I know Angela, a couple other people from iRay. They have an office in Fort Worth. I'm not sure where you are, perhaps. But anyhow, where was I? Who got that? And this is a good question. Can you cover thermal generations in a few words? Thermal generations. So everything started with the semiconductor process to make thermal image sensors are hideously complicated. So it all started with basically first you do one pixel, you try to scan it around. Yeah. Where was I? Yeah, it wasn't allowed. Then they figured out how to make a few more pixels. So the first decent image sensors that were thermal, they had what's called strip arrays, right? So the image sensors that we know all think of, the ones that are all in all these products that I've been showing, have a two-dimensional image sensor array, right? Some number of pixels horizontally, some number of pixels vertically. So you take a snapshot, and you get your picture of some resolution. Well, the first truly viable image sensors didn't do that. They were strip arrays, where if you imagine this is a ruler, so there was some number of pixels vertically, and what happened, what would happen, the camera would be scan like this, keep on taking picture. It would be some temporal delay, but you'd be able to get two-dimensional images. Then we got conceivably even better at making image sensors, although they're scanning something called push broom imagers. They still have their place. Some space applications use them, for example, stuff like that. And then we got better, started doing two-dimensional images, first of very low resolution, then higher and higher and higher. But for all of these, the big problem was cost. And one of the big drivers of cost was that aside from very exotic semiconductor materials, these types of cameras have to be cooled to cryogenic temperatures. Traditionally, they were running at approximately 77, 78 Kelvin, right? Which is really, really cold. Approximately what, minus 100 and what? 0 to 113 minus, okay, minus 130, 140 centigrade. So minus 270, minus 200 centigrade, excuse me, which is cold. Now there are same type of image sensors run at hotter temperatures, right? When you see something called hot detector, hot stands for high operating temperature. Well, that's about 150 Kelvin. So instead of minus 200 C, it's only minus 125 C, something like that, 123 C. It's still cryogenic. You still need very sophisticated coolers and all that's getting cheaper, but it's not getting into the range of what normal people are willing to pay for. And all that requires a lot of battery power and stuff like that. There are some commercial rifle scopes that use cool detectors that are in $50,000 to $80,000 range. And at some point, who had the original patent? A company called Honeywell made a patent for something called microbolometry. These are image sensors that work in a very, very different way. I did a live show on that once, admittedly a while back, on how they actually work. But the pixel works entirely differently. The way it collects energy, sees heat, etc., works entirely differently. And they were horribly non-uniform and also hard to manufacture and all that sort of stuff. But the big thing was that once you figured out how to make them, it was possible to scale it up using a somewhat unusual fab process, but still semiconductor type process, right? More like MEMS, sort of a process. And you didn't have to cool them to cryogenic temperatures, right? The first microbolometers and some of the scientific ones still had small TEC coolers. TEC stands for thermoelectric coolers. These are basically Peltier devices, the types of things that cool microprocessors and all the gaming machines. Well, some, in terms of control, a little bit more sophisticated versions of the same basic technology would keep these microbolometers running at a fairly consistent temperature, but it was not that far removed from room temperature. Now we've got better at making them, calibrating them, we understand better the performance. So now most of these are truly uncooled. Means that the temperature of the image sensor changes with the ambient, and the way we calibrate them, we know the performance of this thing well enough where we can correct for all of that. Because remember, these things see heat, right? That means they're extraordinarily sensitive to their own temperature, right? And we have to take that account and basically figure out what is the own temperature of the camera body and stuff, and what is the heat that it sees far away. We've gotten very good in figuring that out, and that's what created this microbolometer revolution with uncooled image sensors that we are witnessing now. Okay. Right. Like I said, I think I'll look through the live shows. I think I did one on how this stuff works, and if I haven't, I'll be happy to do that again. I used to develop image sensors for this kind of stuff. That's quite literally my field of expertise. All right, what else we have here? For some period, the current Polish governments, I hate them, allowed to purchase decommissioned to all EU residents, but Poles, of course. They also make a ton of crap regarding gun laws to not allow it for us. Yeah, governments basically do that. And Brooks Precision, I would imagine these thermal sensors will take off with higher and higher pixels, like the regular camera sensors took off. I assume you mean higher pixel counts. In theory, you would think that. In practice, it has been extraordinarily difficult. There are microbolometers of higher resolution, and the price jumps by an order of magnitude immediately, right? I've seen some, samples, one of 2, 3, 4, 5 megapixel microbolometers in labs, etc. The image is amazing. No one so far has been able to make them viable. There is a company I know of through my day job. I talk to them a good bit. Of everyone that I know of, I think they have the best chance of scaling up pixel resolutions. But you have to be a little bit careful here, right? The way resolution scaled up for conventional image sensors in your cell phone, stuff like that, is that they kept on making pixels smaller. But there is a physical limit in terms of how small you should go and still have a resolution advantage, right? And that limit, it has to do with diffraction limit. It also has to do with the wavelength of light. For sensors that see regular visible light, same light that we see with our naked eye, the typical wavelengths are in the 400 to 700 nanometer range, or 0.4 to 0.7 micron range. For the thermal image sensors that we're talking about, they are in a long-wave infrared band, and that band is from 8 to 12 microns. In practical terms, you can't really get any resolution advantages when you hit pixel size, pixel dimensions, width, and height, that are broadly comparable to the wavelength of light that you're looking at. So Samsung is now on some of the new cell phones developed some image sensors with 0.8, 0.65 micron image pixel pitch, which is essentially the same as the wavelength of light that they're trying to see. For thermal, the state of the art for affordable microbolometers right now is 12 micron pixel pitch, and that's already right there with the wavelength of light in long wave infrared. I have seen, excuse me, my phone is going crazy. I wonder why. I don't know. Not important. Between all the moves, etc., I never know where my kids are, so I check my phone carefully. Where was I? Yeah. So now the pixel can't really get smaller, because if you, let's say, go to 6-7 micron pixel pitch for thermal images working in long wave infrared, you're not getting any resolution advantage. So you can't really make the pixel much smaller. iRay already has 10 micron pixel pitch, and going smaller than that for what we need doesn't really do anything. So now, if you are trying to get high resolution, the actual image sensor starts getting bigger. If the image sensor gets bigger, optics get bigger, and everything changes. So there is sort of a almost an avalanche type effect here, where if you get resolutions high, everything else gets bigger. So the price of what you're looking at will start going up, not only because the image sensor is more expensive, but because everything else starts getting expensive. And large diameter thermal optics are actually quite expensive. All right, what else we have? Okay, I think I covered all the questions we had for right now. And let's go back to talking about iRay. So most of the Chinese manufactured thermal cores that we see here are made by one of two companies, iRay and Guide. Some companies very freely tell you who makes what. iRay obviously tells you it's iRay, it's them. But they also sell their subsystems, sometimes imaging cores, sometimes imaging core and a lens, sometimes they probably make more than that. How much iRay really makes with their customers probably varies from customer to customer, and nobody really knows for sure other than the people who are involved. For some of them I know a little bit, and I should not get into it, but for most of them I really don't know. But when you look at the menu system and things like that, you can kind of figure out who has been making what. For example, the Leica thermals that I have used in the past and I've talked about, the cores are clearly iRay. I suspect the integration stuff is indeed done by Leica in Germany. Industrial design is different and all that. But a lot of the insides are clearly coming from China. Burris and Steiner. I should have a Steiner clip on here somewhere. Why didn't I pull it out? Excuse me. Let me go locate it. I've gotten sufficiently fat that my office looks like it has shrunk. But the office is not shrunk. I got fatter. Tragedy of life. There you go. So this is Steiner. So Steiner and Burris are made by Guide Infrared. And I think most of them are made in China, but Steiner has a lot of say in how they build them, and then also how the image is processed, which makes a huge difference. It's kind of a big deal. Acufire looks to me like the core is made by Guide. I don't know if they make more than that or not. But if you once again, if you look at the menu system, some other quirks, you can kind of tell. Bearing Optics that I talked about 2-3 weeks ago, something like that, maybe a little more. That one, the core comes from iRay. Let's see who else. If you bring up other brands, if I've seen them, I'll be able to tell you where the cores come from. But it comes from one of the other. And in terms of image processing, iRay seems to, right offhand, provide a slightly more pleasing image. The way they boost contrast and all that is actually quite good. With Guide, with Guide-based thermal scopes, I have to mess a little bit with the settings, and when I bump up the contrast, it actually looks very, very similar to iRay. iRay right out of the box looks good. They do a really, really good job processing the image. So I have two iRay products here. One I've talked about in the past a good bit. This is a thermal rifle scope called RL42. And what this is a 384 by 288 core. Pixel pitch is 12 microns, so it's a smaller pixel. And the lens focal length is 42 millimeters. Okay. Kind of an interesting thing. So with thermals, how far you can aim, and one of the questions I had in my DLO community was to talk about scanning and finding things versus aiming, and we'll get to that in a moment. If you're trying to aim far away, what is more important, arguably, is the focal length. You want a longer focal length, and you want a smaller pixel pitch, right? And that will shrink the overall field of view, but give you better angular resolution. And using that, it's easier to aim at something. It's harder to find it. For scanning, it will be difficult. But it's easier to aim at distance. iRay's micro, this one is called RH25, is in some ways is basically the opposite of this guy, right? It's a much smaller objective. I don't know if you guys can see it well. There we go. Should be able to read, yeah. Much smaller objective, but much higher resolution image sensor, right? So this guy is the micro is a 640 by 512 image sensor resolution, same 12 micron pixel pitch. So same size pixels, more pixels, but a much smaller, much shorter focal length lens. So this guy gives you a much wider field of view. Let me pull up my table so that I don't have to bullshit excessively. All right. So when I talk about field of view, a lot of people talk about diagonal field of view. I like to talk when we're talking about these things in terms of horizontal field of view, because when we aim at something and it's left-right, it's a little bit more critical. Horizontal field of view for the micro is 13.2 degrees. Horizontal field of view of the RL42 is 4.7 degrees, right? Almost 3 times smaller. So if you're trying to locate something, you want to go wider. But here's a basic problem. If something is coming at you fairly far away, all you see is a warm spot, and it has to come quite a bit closer for you to basically start figuring out what it is. There is this framework for night vision or thermal devices called DRI, detection, recognition, and identification. And identification distance is essentially the distance at which you can shoot something, right? If it is an animal, or if you're a soldier in a war, whatever, basically when you can figure out what you're looking at with reasonable certainty and figure out which part of a body, let's say an animal, let's talk about pig hunting, it's probably more kosher. Not very kosher, but kosher enough. What part of an animal you're going to hit, right? Detection just means there is something warm out there and you can see it, right? Basically, if one pixel is warm and it's very, very different temperature from everything else around it, you know there's something warm-blooded out there. On a colder night especially, everything stands out. But it has to get a lot closer to you, or you have to get a lot closer to it before you can figure out what's what. And we'll talk about detections, just 1 or 2 pixels that stand out. Recognition is when you can kind of tell that it's a sort of a living thing, and you can kind of tell a difference if it's a quadruped or a biped, right? If it's standing upright, or if it has a horizontal back. That's the recognition distance. From a recognition distance, you can't ethically hunt. I suppose if you're a soldier, at that distance, you can probably already shoot something to hit something, right? If you are hunting, you need to hit a particular part of an animal. Recognition distance is still too far. Identification distance is where you can shoot something. So here is the big deal. If you're trying to find something, this is the device. If you're trying to shoot something accurately, this, although it's low resolution and cheaper, will actually work better for you. For my basic identification metric, where I sort of try to calculate how far away you can resolve a pig, regular size pig in Texas, well enough. For the micro, it's in the 250-yard range. For the RL42, it's just over 400-yard range. So there is a big difference, and it's one of those things where tool for a job. Now, at the distances at which I hunt pigs, which usually are inside of 200 yards, which one would I take? Well, it depends. If I'm doing spot and stock and all that, I will absolutely take the micro. Nice wide field of view, much easier for me to find something to locate it. And there's a really good chance I'm going to get inside of a couple of 100 yards, right? If I'm sitting somewhere in a blind, I'm just, have multiple shooting positions. Some of them may be further than others, etc. This sucker works really, really well. Honestly, in the grand scheme of things, I like both of these very well. For hunting and stuff, the RL42 is really interesting. The way most thermal manufacturers approach power consumption is really interesting. This guy runs from 18650s. Acufire runs on 4 CR123s. Steiner runs on 18650s, etc. This thing runs on a completely custom integrated battery, which has some interesting. Okay, guys, I'm gonna have to mute for a moment. I'll be right back. My apologies. So with my wife calls me 3 times, I usually try to pick up. Okay. All right, question. Do thermal scopes and clip-ons use passive cooling mostly? Imagine they can get quite hot. They do use almost exclusively passive cooling. They do get a little bit warm. I did this test when I was testing the bearing, 35mm Super Yotra, I think, one of them, scope. And then after just running it for a while, it did get fairly warm. Some do better than others. Interestingly, of all of the ones I've tried so far, the best cooling, and I'm fairly certain it's passive cooling, is this Acufire. It looks a little bulky, but whatever they did to keep it cold, we had it running. It was running for a while. Batteries last for quite a long time. And we had it in the sun running continuously when, a friend of mine was trying to get this thing, going. And it did not get hot. It was in freaking Texas sun in May, I think, something like that, when I first started messing with it. And it kept its temperature really well and maintained the image quality really, really well. Most of these thermal image sensors, when they start getting warmer, frequently the image quality degrades a little bit. They do prefer to run a little bit cooler. Now, they don't degrade so much as that you won't be able to make a shot, but you can see the difference. Excuse me. Every once in a while, you need to do something called nuke. Nuke stands for non-uniformity correction. Usually, there is a shutter inside, and you hear this little click. It's doing something, right? So it's basically correcting non-uniformities, because as the temperature of the image sensor side changes, it acquires some additional non-uniformity. And this nuke process lets the thermal scope adjust to the changing ambient conditions. Okay, let's see, what was it? I just purchased an AGM ASP Micro TI monocular. It looks good. Have you used it to know anything about its specs? So I have not used Micro TI. What is this? I have seen some of the AGMs at trade shows. I've never used one. I've reached out to them a couple of times, never got a reply, so I sort of stopped trying. If I know anything about its specs, I know a little bit, as always. And so they have a very slow web page. Let me pull it up. The way AGM started, they started with using thermal cores from, where's TI? Okay, one more time. Which one do I have? AGM ASP Micro TI. I'm trying to find it on their webpage. Micro TM. I don't see Micro TI. I see a Micro TM 384. Yeah, I've seen that one. It's perfectly reasonable. So AGM, when they started, they were using microbolometers from a different Chinese company called Hikvision, HIK, but they were sanctioned by the U.S. government. And last I heard, AGM was transitioning to using iRay cores. The guys who started AGM, I think they originally came out of Armasight, when FLIR bought them and then canned the whole product line. They went off sideways and started their company, AGM, so they generally know what they're doing. They've made a few thermal scopes. From what I've seen above of their products, they were perfectly reasonable. I sure it's ASP Micro TI, not Micro TM. Okay. So let's see. I'm looking at it. Interesting. So on their website, they actually also talk about detection, recognition, and identification. It's a comparatively short lens. It's a 50mm lens. So you have nice wide field of view, but resolution, if that's the one, is not super high. Okay. Oh, for fuck's sake. Okay. Where was I? I was preaching something. Oh, yeah. So the batteries for the iRay TL42. It's a completely different battery. Closed, open. It does not want to come out, but I'll get it out. Okay. That's interesting. But anyhow, it's basically a custom battery, more like, I don't know, like camera type battery, that kind of stuff. And it does a couple of interesting things. Over here, this thing has a USB-C port. USB-C port is used for a couple of different things. One is that, well, you can hook it up to a computer, and if you've saved any images, stuff like that, you can copy them to the computer. I don't have a huge amount of interest in that. I'm not using this to take pictures of stuff. Mr. Northwest Guns, how's it going? It's good to see you here, Derek. Is it official already that you are changing venues or not yet? But anyhow, what is a reasonable expected lifespan of a clip-on or thermal camera? Depends on how much you abuse it, honestly. These things can work. These things, I mean, I've seen military type microbolometers work for quite a few years. Technology is moving comparatively rapidly, so there'll be improvements. I don't know if you want to buy this and use this for 20 years, but barring something unforeseen, they can, and if you take reasonable care of them, they can work for quite a few years. Think of it this way. How long do typical camera electronics work? I can't tell you, but I don't abuse my cameras, and I still have a camera that's about 9-10 years old, I think, and I use it and it works. It's not really very different for these things. If they're reasonably well built, if you don't dunk them in water, if you sometimes they'll get drizzled on, they're reasonably well sealed, although not excessively so. If you don't do anything stupid with them, they can work for quite a long time. Okay. All right, it's official. Mr. Northwest Guns will be in the Southwest in 2 months. Not exactly where I am, but close enough where I fully expect that At some point, we will do a live stream together, actually being in the same place. I really, I like making fun of people I do live streams with, and it's much more entertaining to make fun of them when they are literally right next to me. So, looking forward to it, Derek. All right. So I'm complaining that I moved last weekend. Derek is about to move across the country. I moved next door. So, where was I? Yeah. USB port. So what are the other uses with the USB port other than hooking it up to a computer? Well, if you have a power bank, and I have one, no, it's attached to a gun, I shouldn't lift it and get in front of the camera. If you're sitting in a blind, whatever else, you can just plug your USB port in here and run it off of the external power. Well, most of them you can do that, right? That's how I run the Burris, the Steiner, all of these. The difference is that with all the rest of them that I've tried to date, when I plug in external power, the site runs off of external power, and the batteries that are sitting there are just sitting there. While with the RL42, which I really liked, is that when I plug in external power, it's running off external power and also slowly charging up the battery that's in here. I'm guessing it's because it is some sort of a custom battery rather than a conventional cylinder battery of some sort. Another function for this USB port is to get the input from the laser rangefinder in. They loaned me the laser rangefinder as well. It's on a quick detachable mount. It basically goes on here. If I manage, no, that's closed. This is open. There you go. Goes on here. The whole thing becomes a little bit bulky, right? So I don't know if I'd necessarily walk around with like this. Sitting in a blind, it was extremely useful. I was able to look at things and lace them. It is the same USB-C type connector, connects into the same port. You need to press 2 buttons to enable this thing, and it displays distance in the upper right-hand corner of the image. In practice, it worked really quite well. Do I love the integration? Not too much. I would prefer it to be a little bit slicker. For my purposes, the way I use these things, they have the control buttons up top. There are 4 buttons, power menu, picture taking, all that sort of stuff. And this sits way to the side, and it's kind of offset and all that. I don't know. For my purposes, I would have probably tried to come up with a solution where laser rangefinder sits on top, but there's a lot of stuff happening on top. The image focus knob is here. Most thermal scopes out there just have a rotating thing around the objective, which is what I prefer. The knob is just one more thing to stick out. If it was up to me, I would probably get rid of the knob, make something rotate here, and put a short Picatinny rail for the laser rangefinder to be on top. I think it's a slicker solution that's sitting to the side. But on the other hand, I didn't have any issues. I didn't have hugely long distances to deal with, but I was lasing at night, so 800 meters, 800 yards or so it lased. I didn't have anything really to look at that was more than 800 yards away. So that worked quite nicely. Okay. What else can I tell you? I like the mount. It's from American Defense Manufacturing. The mount worked pretty well. Everything they do here is based on levers, so you don't need tools for anything. I don't know how much I care. Not a huge fan of QD mounts, mostly, but for thermals, that seems to work fine. There is, of course, eyepiece focus and all that sort of jazz, all the usual controls. It is sort of a little bit of an odd duck in terms of configurations. There are very few similar devices there because it's a low-resolution core, but with a smaller pixel pitch. For example, the Accufire and the Burris, they both have similar low-resolution core, right? But the pixel pitch is 17 microns. There are not a lot of low-resolution cores with 12 microns, so this iRay kind of stands a little. It's not quite a lot. I think Behring has something like that, but stands almost alone. What this low resolution core allows you to do is, with a small pixel pitch, it allows you to aim very far away, but you don't have to pay for a high resolution core. What kind of a difference does it make? A couple of $1,000s usually is what is the difference between higher and lower resolution cores from most manufacturers. From iRay, for example, MSRP on this guy is about $4,000. MSRP for this guy is about $6,000, right? And the biggest difference really is the imaging core resolution. I mean, everything else on the micro in principle should be cheaper, right? It's a smaller device, smaller optic and all that. The core is more expensive. There's new integration. It has a few more options and stuff like that. Okay. All right, I am going to pause for a moment, and then I'm going to continue to talk a little bit about micro and about a few other things I've seen from iRay. If you have any questions, start putting them in. I'm going to talk about the micro for about 5 minutes, and I want to go back and have a discussion of the clip-ons that I started covering. All right. For those of you who joined late, I found one more Zippo lighter with my Dark Lord of Optics logo, and whoever can figure out what's in this glass, or at least get close to it, I'm going to send you a lighter. So micro. Really like this thing. Don't like the price, but it does a lot of things, and it does these things fairly well. Runs over a single 18650 battery, runs for I think about 4 hours, something like that, which for a single battery is just fine. You can essentially run it in a couple of different modes. I primarily used it as a monocular and as a clip-on. To run it as a monocular, it's fairly trivial. It fits nicely in the hand. You have your eyepiece, and you go for it, right? To run it as a clip-on, you press a button. There's a long press of a button, and what it does, it changes the projected field of view on the back, to something smaller. And what it does is essentially this. Remember, in the beginning, for those of you who are patient enough to be here from the beginning, I talked about the difference in resolution of the output screens and of the image sensors, right? And there is a reason for my madness. So let's say, where's my chalk? There it is. So let's say you have, in the micro, what's the output screen resolution? So output screen resolution on the micro is 1024 by 768, and the image sensor is 640 by 512. Okay. So normally, when you are using this thing as a monocular, there's a little bit of magnification. Okay. What are the things that are important for a clip-on to work well as a clip-on? One of the most important things for a clip-on is, if it is a clip-on, to have exact unity magnification. It has to be exactly 1x. Why does it have to be 1x? Because the field of view coming into a clip-on and field of view coming out of the clip-on has to be identical. Otherwise, your whatever zero you had on your original rifle scope is basically useless, right? What else is important for a clip-on? Other than 1x magnification, it's very, very important that the optical axis of the light coming in and optical axis of the light coming out are parallel to each other. That's what's called collimation. When you're doing this whole complicated collimation process, right, what you're trying to make sure this thing is built by humans, right? So you can have, let me get a different color chalk. Let's go with yellow. Okay, you can have light coming in on this axis and coming out like this, right? Because the back part and the front part are not tied by anything optical, right? Optics coming in gets converted to electrical signal. All sorts of massaging happens here. Electrical signal comes here, gets converted back to optical energy. So the only thing that's maintaining some sort of alignment between output and the input is how well it is built mechanically. And that, everything's built by humans. There's going to have some sort of tolerance in it. So what you want is that you want this output to be exactly collinear, exactly same axis. Now, it doesn't have to be the same height. They just have to be parallel to each other, right? There are some clip-ons out there, like this German company called TIG-IR. They have this interesting folded design that looks like this. So the lens is here, this device is here, the output is here. So light comes in here, image sensor somewhere here, there's a bunch of electronics, all sorts of other things, displays here. There's an interesting prism there, very interesting design, very short. Okay, and the visible light comes out here. So there is an offset between them. Line of sight is higher than line of output. That doesn't matter from a standpoint of a clip-on. What matters, there's a little bit of this parallax, it really makes no difference. What matters is that this and this are perfectly parallel to each other. So when you are performing this process called collimation, at least what people call it collimation, I'm not 100% certain it's the right name for it. When you talk about collimation, what you're trying to do, you're trying to set up the input and output optical axes to be perfectly parallel to each other. Okay. So I'm going to stop for a second. Is this making sense to you? Because this is an important point. These are the things that make a clip-on. You have to have unity magnification, as perfectly one axis possible. Excuse me. And the input and the output optical axes have to be perfectly parallel to each other. Okay. So the way clip-ons existed before thermals existed, right? They have been night vision clip-ons for a little while. And night vision devices are perfectly analog devices. So the signal is never digitized. Last week when I talked, when I talked about the Photonis night vision monocular, right? We talked a little bit about there's no digitization happening anywhere. So how do you make sure that an input and output on the a night vision device, how do you make sure that they're parallel? So there they use these prisms, something called Risley prisms. And the way Risley prisms work is, let's see, how well can you see here? All right. Is there something here? Oh, not something on my screen. Never mind. All right, I'm gonna try to do this. It's not a very large board, so I'll give it a shot. So the way a night vision device works, let's separate this. Can you see? Yeah. The way night vision device works, right? So you have objective. It focuses light somewhere. Here there is a small image intensifier tube that amplifies it, right? There is a phosphor screen and some sort of eyepiece optics. Okay. And you have light coming in, gets amplified, and comes out. Well, you can have all sorts of misalignments here. So in night vision clip-on, what they put in here is a set of rotating prisms that can be rotated. They're essentially called Risley prisms. I don't remember exact shape, but essentially 3 wedge prisms. When light goes through a prism, it gets offset by a certain angle, right? And you have this set of 3 prisms, and you start rotating one of them a little bit, and that allows you to do beam steering. Depending on how you've rotated one of these prisms, the beam comes out like this, and you can direct it, go a little bit down or a little bit up or straight forward, etc. So what you do when you're doing this collimation using Risley prisms, Risley is R-I-S-L-E-Y, if anybody wants to look it up. When you're doing this collimation using Risley prisms, is you're basically something called your beam steering. Interesting. Somebody here says that Risley prism is 2 prisms. Okay, maybe 2. I saw a solution with 3 ones. Whatever it is, it's a couple of prisms that move with respect to each other and change the angle of the output beam. Okay. In a thermal, you shouldn't have to do that, because every time you start to introduce optical elements, it's a huge pain in the ass. You have to make now the position of the prisms consistent, or you will have the same collimation issues. You have to zoom in on it. So the lens I'm using is actually a prime lens. I can't easily zoom in on that. I don't know. I'll take a picture of this, I guess, and I'll post it, discussion, or the video will be available afterwards. Maybe we'll be able to zoom in on that in the video. Where was I? Yeah. Whenever you introduce additional optical elements, they have to be mounted, aligned, it adds weight, it adds complexity. They have to be approved for recoil and stuff like that. And with prisms like crystal prisms, it gets more complicated because they also have to move. So you can't just glue them in place, right? So something there, you have to be able to rotate it. Something's going to have to scan. It's kind of gnarly. There are situations where with thermals, you kind of have to use the Riesler prism. What are those situations? Well, let's say you have an image sensor with 640 by 512 image pixels, and the output screen is also 640 by 512 pixels, right? So you have pixel-to-pixel correspondence, and from an image processing standpoint, that actually has a lot of advantages, right? It's very easy to get your thermal image, digitize it, create a regular digitized image out of it, and then just project it out pixel by pixel. Okay, that's fairly straightforward, works well. But now, if you want to sight in, right, where you have to try to correct for this misalignment, something like that, you no longer have any electronic means to do that. You have to do this optically, and that is where you may have to use some sort of steering prisms with a thermal riflescopes. Virtually all of the commercial clip-ons that I know of don't do that. What they do, they use a display of higher resolution. Okay. And now so just in case, since I'm going to erase this thing, just in case, I'm going to take a picture so that I can potentially use it afterwards. Oh, it's so much glare. It's okay. I'm going to erase it, and we'll talk a little bit about the output screen and how it all works. Still a few people here. I thought once I get nerdy, I'm going to bore you guys to death. I mean, survivors. I'm impressed. Oh, that so doesn't work well. I need a better solution. Does my hand work better? Not by much. Okay. I am going to sacrifice some of my precious sparkling water and see if that gets me a better result. Cheers. And it does. All right. So you have an output display that's some number of pixels. Let's just think of it as a rectangular thing. There's a bunch of pixels. Okay. The image sensor is a smaller number of pixels. What normally happens, you can basically, let's say this is 1024 by 768, and image sensor is some smaller pixel count, let's say 640 by 512. You need to cast this into this. So normally what you do, you generate a digital image, then you upscale it, and you leave a little bit on the borders, right? So you're not using the entirety of the display. What happens is that if it's a scope or clip-on or whatever else, you live in a rifle scope, let's say, you live a little bit outside, because what happens, it's called windowing. You're using a smaller window of the image sensor. And when you're sighting in, you're moving this window up and down, left, right a little bit. So you're using slightly different pixels. And what happens is that when you are moving this window somewhere, up or down or left or right, behind a lens that projects it out to your eye, in a good quality rifle scope, you're not looking straight, you're not looking directly at this tiny little screen, right? There are some lenses that project it out, magnify it, and all that sort of stuff. So if you move this window up, down, left, right, it changes the angular position of the image, and that's how you do sighting. What they do with clip-ons, most of the clip-ons, like the micro, for example, most of the clip-ons have a monocular mode where you're using most of the screen or the entirety of it, and a clip-on mode. And in a clip-on mode, if you switch it to a clip-on, you see that all of a sudden you're using a much smaller window on the output screen. The detail of the image you are displaying did not change, right? You are still using all of the pixels of the image sensor, 640 by 512, whatever, or close to it, depending on where you're doing the sighting. Right now, they are cast into a much smaller region of interest, much smaller window on the output display, and the size of this window is specifically calculated so that this projects exactly the same field of view that's coming in. Remember, when you are dealing with a rifle scope, whether thermal or visible, or doesn't matter, field of view coming in versus field of view coming out, if they are identical, and so it's a 1x rifle scope, right? Magnification is just a ratio, field of view coming out to field of view coming in. And for clip-on, it has to be unity. What is the advantage of it being unity? What happens is that you have your day scope set up. Let's see. I'll grab one later, right? You have your day scope set up. It's already sighted in and everything. If your clip-on is perfectly collimated, you pop it in front of the day scope. And if it's perfect unity and it's perfectly collimated, you fire a shot, your zero has not changed. Now, you may end up aiming, depending on some of the other offsets and all sorts of other crap, you may end up not aiming through the center of the clip-on, right? Your reticle might end up, it shouldn't if everything's set up correctly, but it might end up, instead of being in the center, it might end up being here somewhere. Doesn't matter. As long as the clip-on is perfect 1x magnification and as long as it is well collimated, your zero has not really changed. Okay. Okay. Where was I? Yeah, the zero has not really changed. Okay. Is this making some sort of sense? Any sort of sense? Yes, no, maybe. Okay. I hope it does. Okay. Where was I? Okay. Going back to the micro for a moment. So the micro can work in a clip-on mode, and it is equipped with a mount for it. So it's also small enough to be put potentially on a helmet. So it has this thing called the pigtail mount, where it's a little Picatinny section, and this triangle, I don't know the name of this dovetail. It's the same one that Wilcox uses and others, and it works with most of the helmet mounts. Works with mine. Okay, and ADM, I believe, makes for iRay a mount. It's basically a quick detachable mount. It's QD on the top and on the bottom, so it hooks up to. If I can figure out how to do this. No, I locked it. No, man. There we go. So it's hooked up to Picatinny rail, and you just basically put it on a Picatinny rail in front of a scope. Let me grab a day scope, because one of the questions I had was about mounting of clip-ons, and I want to spend a minute on that. Okay, let's use this guy. So there are a couple of different ways of setting up clip-ons in front of day scopes. So the most common way in the US, because more often than not, you're putting a clip-on on something, on some sort of a I think Mr. Chen is making fun of me. Good, we have recordings. Okay. So the most common way of doing this, you get your scope, right? And you have a long Picatinny rail on a handguard or monolithic rail, whatever. And you basically set it out like this. You get them as close together as possible without jamming anything in. The rubber eyepiece comes off. And they basically go like this, and try to match them out so that the height is close enough. If they're very slightly mismatched, it doesn't really matter a ton. Slight loss of contrast, but not much. You want them to be at about the same height and not touching. Okay. So that's the most common way of doing this if you have an AR or something with a forward Picatinny rail. Okay. That's the method I mostly use, but most of the time when I am hunting something, I have my Q guns. I have a couple of fixes and a minifix. I have this long monolithic rail. The one I hunt with more often than not when I'm not testing something is this Burris BTC50, and it has the same basic Picatinny mount. Just claps on in front of the scope, and we're off to the races. Okay. Another way of doing this is using an adapter that clamps onto the objective of the rifle scope. So I have a couple here made by a company called Rusan in Croatia. Okay, it's an interesting question. So you can have universal clip-on rifle mount. I'm not sure what that means by universal. Could you please clarify? So the way this thing works, on the inside here, there are threads, and it attaches to the back of a rifle scope. For example, so the Acufire is a different thread. This was for a very specific one. But basically, this slides onto the objective. There's a little lever there that tightens this thing. And the clip-on is lined up here. Now it's hanging on the objective. So that I've seen that fairly commonly done on conventional bolt guns. Oh, actually, the Steiner comes with such a. I was using this with a Steiner P4XI. So this is an adapter that Steiner provided. Steiner, whatever. Okay. You basically set up like this. So now in this configuration, the clip-on is not touching anything on the rifle. It's just hanging off of the objective of the rifle scope, and the rifle scope is mounted. This has advantages and disadvantages. The big advantage is that I don't need to worry about matching mounts, right? This is now the clip-on and the rifle scope are automatically lined up, and whatever stray light and other crap I may have in there is going to be shielded quite nicely. The downside is that you may end up with a good amount of weight hanging on the rifle scope, and with many rifle scopes, and it depends on how it's mounted and all this sort of jazz. With many rifle scopes, and this Steiner clip-on, this is one of the heavier ones. I think it's like close to 2 pounds. You put 2 pounds on the objective rifle scope, you might shift 0. Not on all of them, on some of them. And it's not so easy to check. So you might sight everything in, get the clip-on adjusted and all that, just to realize that your day scope 0 has also shifted, and it's kind of spring-loaded, and is it going to keep shifting? Is it going to stay constant? All that sort of stuff. It gets a little bit tricky. Now, what helps here is that, first of all, a lot of people do this and they clearly don't have a ton of problems. So the method clearly works well enough, and I'm probably just being paranoid. And another is that when hunting with thermals, we're still not shooting that far away, right? So if there is a tiny amount of deflection due to the thermal hanging on it, and I'm shooting pigs within 200 yards, if it deflects it by an inch or inch and a half, whatever. I mean, I'm shooting at a fairly large animal. I'm shooting fairly large area of an animal that I need to hit. It's not really that big of a concern. The best that I can tell, right? Yeah, but the paranoia in me has doubts. So for my own personal use, I go through the pains of matching the heights and using separately mounted thing. But I mostly do this on fixed guns or ARs that have long rails where I can do this. If you choose to go with this method where you're clamping it on a objective rifle scope, when you are setting up the rings for it, make sure the front ring is as far forward as possible without interfering with the mount, right? So don't put your front ring all the way back here. Try to get it as close to here as possible without touching this thing. The further forward the front ring is, the less likely you are to shift the zero of the day scope by hanging weight on the front of it. Okay. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. Okay, it's good. It's a good question. How much does it matter that the handguard is stiff for clip-ons? Is some play acceptable? So the fun thing is that if your clip-on is unity magnification and it's perfectly collimated, it can be sitting like this or like this, and your zero has not shifted. As long as you can see through it, once again, you might not end up aiming with the center. You might end up aiming with some other portion of the image. It'll still be centered in the rifle scope image, but in the thermal image, it may not be centered, but your point of aim will not shift. Right now, if it's super wobbly and it's all over the place, not a good thing because it can be shifting dynamically and there's all sorts of a mess. But by and large, and sturdier is better, but it's not a huge concern if your clip-on is set up correctly. Okay, is it possible to use as a clip-on and a rifle scope interchangeably? I think the question is that can you use something as a rifle scope or as a clip-on? If it is set up for it, yes. So clip-ons generally don't have aiming reticles in them, but for example, the Accufire that I have here is set up to be used as a rifle scope or as a clip-on. So you can use the same thing for everything as long as the eyepiece optics and stuff are set up for it. Okay, I'm going to blow my nose, so I'm going to mute. Pardon me. Your thoughts on helmet-mounted thermal in unison with night vision? Do the images superimpose? Are you talking about having night vision in front of one eye and thermal in front of the other eye, something like that? No, the images generally don't superimpose. For that to work, you need to perfectly match the fields of view and do a lot of practice. I played with it a little bit. All I got out of it was a vertigo and a headache. If you're trying to fuse night vision with thermal, I mean, military has what's called the NVGs, enhanced night vision goggles. I used to work on those 20 years ago at Raytheon. That does it very well. They're not easily commercially available, but I mean, there are some, I think. And ideally, you want the images to be fused by electronics and then delivered to your eye, then have different images coming into different eyes and try to have your brain fuse them. The one interesting exception there is this ECOTI device, ECOTI by Optics One, which is basically a small thermal imager with a 40-degree field of view to match standard PVS 14. And has a little arm that projects the image out, and it goes through the objective, makes for a very faint image, and goes through the objective of the night vision, and then it actually surprisingly nicely superimposed to a night vision monoculars or binoculars image. That works fairly well. It's very expensive. I don't know if I'd necessarily spend my money on it, but if you really want to fuse it, that's one of the available options. Excuse me. It's one of those things. By and large, for hunting, I generally lean comparatively strongly toward thermal rather than night vision. A good example of what they do for you for different things is a thermal will allow you to figure out if there are warm-blooded animals around, right? As long as they're not obstructed by something. But basically, if there is direct line of sight and it's pitch black, thermal doesn't care if there is any light around. However, thermal will not let you navigate, right? Will not allow you to walk, will not tell you where trees are, walls are, rocks are, all that sort of stuff. if there is any light around, or if you have an illuminator, a night vision device will absolutely tell you where you are, tell you a lot about the terrain and everything around you. However, if there is an animal out there, or some sort of warm-blooded creature, enemy combatant, an animal, whatever else, unless you manage to get a reflection from the eye, from the eyes, using an illuminator or something like that, and that doesn't always work in infrared, the animal does not stand out from the environment at all. Okay, so in a grand scheme of things, what you want is a combination of thermal and night vision, right? That's what ENVG is. There's a reason why military has been working on it and perfecting it and doing a really good job with it for quite a long time. Because to figure out if there are threats out there, you really need thermal, and to figure out where the hell you are and what's happening around you in terms of inanimate objects, you need night vision, right? Cheers. All right. We've been at it for about an hour and 20 minutes. I don't feel like preaching anything anymore, so I'm going to stick around and take questions if you guys have anything. Preferably on thermals, anything I talked about today, but day scopes, war in Ukraine, pick one. Anything that I generally talk about is now fair game. Unfortunately, I have to send both of these iRay products, the Micro and RL42, back. And I'm not entirely excited about it. Really like them. As a general purpose device, I really like the Micro. For a general purpose thermal, to me, basically, I think for the types of things that I do, which is some observation, detection, stuff like that, and hunting and stuff like that, I want to be able to aim at a ballpark pig size animal at, let's say, what's a good distance? 300, 350 yards. I want to be able to shoot about 300, 350 yards, somewhere there. And once I achieve that, I don't care too much about shooting further than that. I don't hunt that far out with thermals. I'm comfortable restricting myself, let's say. And because I mostly hunt pigs, not really coyotes. I'm comfortable restricting myself within that with that general range. And once we achieve that targeting distance, if you wish, then I want to see what I can do to get the widest possible field of view. And that basic combination happens somewhere in a 30 to 35 millimeter focal length range for an objective, and with a 12 micron pixel pitch. So the devices like the Envision's Nox 35, like the Steiner's C35 and S35, all these guys, they give me the basic targeting distance also of about 340 yards, 350 yards, something like that. They have 640 by 480 image sensors, 12 micron pixel pitch. Right. Once I'm kind of getting to that distance, now I'm just itching to get a higher resolution sensor. The iRay is a 25 millimeter lens. So practical targeting distance, how far I'm willing and able to shoot an animal with the Micro, is about 250 yards. It's a little bit less than I'd like, but it's very workable for all the places in Texas where I occasionally go shoot pigs. We sit in the blind most of the time, and we're looking at feeders in there 120 to maybe 180 yards away, something like that. Fairly perfectly reasonable distance, and a Micro would be perfectly sufficient there. But the field of view is nice. Being able to, without scanning too much, to see a fairly large swath of land and being able to recognize if there's anything warm out there is, to me, nicely valuable. Right. Interestingly, so the common, with the 12 micron pixel pitch, the common objective lens lengths at 25 millimeter, just shorter than I like. and 35 millimeter, which is just longer than I need. So if I could have something with like 30 millimeter, it would probably be perfect for my purposes. All right, we've got a question. What is really the max detection distance we can expect with a handheld thermal? Just looking for warm bodies, not necessarily identifying. So once again, it comes down to the different focal lengths. With a 25 millimeter focal length, most of the smaller binoculars are 19 and 25 millimeter focal length lenses. So the way I define my identification criteria is basically distance where 14 pixels subtend a 5-foot object, right? So with something like this, I can detect something is out there to at least 1,000 yards, probably a little bit more, something like that. But as far as identifying it, there are different criteria for that, but for assuming a 5-foot object, so horizontally big, vertically a smallish human, something like that, if I'm assuming 14 pixels is what I need for identification, for recognition, I need about a third of that, right? So if I'm saying identification with this guy is 250 yards, that means that recognition is maybe 700, 750 yards. Detection is a little more than that, something like that. Okay. Going to a longer focal length dramatically improves the distance at which you can see stuff, but it makes the field of view narrow. So this is always a trade-off, right? You will see further, but you'll need to do more scanning. So that's where the trade-off is. So the question is actually interesting. Would going to a longer focal length change this drastically as the limiting factor atmospheric conditions? With thermals, atmospheric condition, unless it's raining, something like that, or snowing, atmospheric conditions don't make a ton of difference. I mean, there is always some, but it's really not particularly significant. The cores are sufficiently low resolution that we're fairly far away, once again, unless it's pouring rain. We're fairly far away from atmospheric conditions making a huge difference. Now, if you're trying to actually look at objects, if everything is wet after the rain, and so this low water layer changes the emissivity of objects you're looking at, so you will see decreased contrast and stuff like that. But it will affect you the same whether you have longer or shorter focal length. It's really just a trade-off between distance and field of view more than anything else. Okay. I see BAE has a high definition thermal core 1920 by 2800 out now. Do you expect this core to make it to the recreation market? Not anytime soon. It's really expensive. BAE is not the only one, all right? iRay has some cameras with same full HD cores, and I think like the camera was like 30 grand last time I checked, something like that. It was really not practical to put it into a rifle scope. They would sell 2 of them. So it may be a little while, but once again, I know one company that does microbolometers a little bit differently, and the way their technology works is it's easier for them to scale up resolution than for conventional uncooled manufacturers. If we see cost-effective, high-resolution thermal images, it's likely to be from them. When they're ready to go for prime time, I'll tell you the name and tell you what they're up to. Combination of thermal and night vision is new technology. Is it even available to civilians, and how much is it? So it's not a very new technology. Like I said, I've been working on it for 20 years ago, and we had it, it worked. And it's been getting consistently better since then. I don't think I've ever seen one in civilian hands, but that wouldn't surprise me if some people have it. But I don't know what it would be cost for civilians, 20 to 30K, something like that at least. Okay. How does the RL42 image compare to the Envision Halo in humid weather? So I have not seen them side by side, but I have spent a fair amount with Halo time of Halo LR. It has both a longer lens and a higher resolution core. Halo is a better scope in every way I can think of. Really, it's really a very nice design. Easily one of my favorites if you need to shoot far away. It works from what I've seen. It actually does surprisingly well in humid weather. But it's also a lot more expensive, right? So this sucker is 4,000. The Halo will get you into 8.5, 9 more sometimes if it's with a laser rangefinder. So it depends. Mr. Firepring, thanks for the response. It gives me a much better idea what I will look for. You're very, very welcome. Yeah, once again, if there's something we don't cover today at darklordofoptics.com, that's sort of where I live. Chris, what's better, clip-on thermal or dedicated thermal scope? If it's a dedicated pig gun or something like that, dedicated thermal scope usually is a simpler package that's a little bit lighter and all that sort of stuff. That having been said, I sort of have this paranoid thing about not relying excessively on rifle scopes that are electronic only. I want some sort of an optical thing. So I tend to use clip-ons, but there is usually a weight and size penalty to that. So if you're going for the lightest possible way, thermal rifle scope is the way to go. If you're not, for me, I'm willing to pay a little bit of a weight penalty and have a clip-on. It also sort of depends on which gun it is. For example, this Steiner clip-on that I was using, right? I was trying to figure out if I can easily break it, so I put it on my AR-15 chambered for 58 SOCOM. Conventional thermal rifle scopes usually have eye relief that's comparatively short. There's some longer ones, most of them are comparatively short. And I'm not really itching to put that on anything with kick. If I am putting it behind in front of the conventional rifle scope, let's say this, I like to use LPVOs with clip-ons because of the magnification range. Oh, it's another thing I didn't cover, native magnification range. Give me a second. Okay, so here's my eye relief, and if I put a clip-on in front of it, here's still my eye relief. So if you're shooting something with a kick, I prefer to use a conventional. Rifle scope, just because I don't like getting hit in the eye. Well, thanks. I bought the Halo LR, but don't want to buy a second Envision due to price. Yeah, that's very understandable. If you can live with a narrow field of view, in terms of targeting distance for the price, the RL42 is probably one of the better options out there. But for the money, probably the best bang for the buck would be something from Bearing Optics. So look at what Bearing offers, and I think they have some 640 by 480. So the 35mm lens, 640 by 480 rifle scope from Bearing that I tested, I think it was Superior S, something like that. Don't remember the name. It was about $4,000, and for $4,000, it's an amazingly good price. I'm pretty sure they have versions that also with a 50mm lens, which will give you close to the same distance you're getting with Halo LR. Maybe not identical, but close. For a lot less money. So if you're looking for something in a budget, iRay is good to look at. Bearing is good to look at. Steiner S35 is a little bit heavy. I really like the imaging performance of it. I'm actually supposed to have one here somewhere, but I'll be damned if I know where it is in this mess. It's a funny thing, I've got can't locate a $5,000 thermal scope. Like, you'd think I'd keep better track of all this shit. I don't know. Where was I? Yeah, something I did not. Okay. Is there a limit to the objective bell size? Say 52mm, is it just a connection? Yeah, it's just the adapter, right? So Rusad makes these for a bunch of different diameters, for example, like has an adapter for 56mm scope. Now, for guns where I might be putting a clip-on, I try not to use ginormous scopes. And if you're using one, it's actually better than to use this kind of an adapter to attach directly to the objective belt than to use to just mount it on a Picatinny rail in the front. And the reason is that with a very large objective, even at night, but if it's not fully dark yet, the rifle scope is seeing a lot of stuff around the clip-on, and it will greatly degrade the contrast of the thermal image that you see. And what this adapter here does, one of the things it does is making sure that the day scope does not see any light other than what's coming through the thermal, which is important. Okay. What was I saying? Yeah, native magnification. So most commercially available thermal clip-on, when you put in front of the scope, you will basically get the full field of view of the thermal with a magnification somewhere between 1.5 and 3 power, right? With something in it, depends really on the focal length of the objective and the field of view, really, of the sensor. With the micro, it's about 1.5 degrees. With the versus BTC 50, because it's a longer 50mm lens, it's about 2.5 magnification, something like that. And then it also varies depending on which scope it is, right? If you've got a wide field of view scope, magnification is going to be a little bit different. In my Excel, I think I did this. Yeah. So I modeled the horizontal field of view of a few different low power variables that I use with clip-ons, the March 1 to 8, the Psi 1 to 6, Steiner's P4XI, so I can roughly calculate what the native magnification is. Now, with you can't take, if you have a variable day scope, right, you can take magnification, you start zooming in a little bit, and the image will start getting bigger. But all you're doing is that you're really just zooming in on the center portion of the thermal image, right? So the image looks bigger, but you're not getting any more resolution. You just start seeing pixelation, you start seeing pixels. So zooming in gives you a little bit more, but honestly, not as much as you would necessarily think. All right. What else you got, guys? All right. Okay, that's an interesting question. Randall is here. Off the subject, but for the bigger picture in optics, electro-optics, open source coalition. Anyway, best pathway we can try to push the industry to make all future electro-optic systems all open source. So a Kestrel could talk to a SIG PDC optic, or rangefinder, or a ranging set of binos, etc. Not proprietary like to SIG and others are. If no one organizes it, it will never happen. Just a plug again for a crusade to drop ideas into the optic world for the future. It is a very good question. But I don't know what kind of leverage you have over a company like SIG. So with thermals night vision, it's been sort of a cottage industry in many ways. And now the big players are going in, the SIGs, Burris, Steiner, all these guys. So it will probably change. But I don't think any of them are particularly motivated to do anything in terms of compatibility. So unless you get somebody big to buy in and standardize on it and gain market share that way, I don't think you'll be able to make a compelling enough case for the other manufacturers. Good idea. I like where you're going with this. But to push something like this through, you need leverage, and I'm not convinced I see where that leverage is going to come from. Best places to browse thermals. thermal makes we should avoid. So I have not tested or looked at all thermals yet. So I'm going through it piece by piece. So far, most of the stuff I've seen has been actually perfectly reasonable. Some things I like a little more than others. Most of what I've seen so far, iRay, Burris, Steiner, Behring, and Vision have been Trigicon, have been perfectly reasonable. I haven't really seen a ton of issues. I didn't like Trigicon's Snipe IR as a clip-on. Something was a little bit off with that thing, but it's possible that the one I played with wasn't great. There was some weird flare with TIG IR, but it was not bad at all. I don't know. So some of the older ATNs that I've seen, I was not hugely impressed with, but some of the newer ones have been good. So everybody's been kind of shaping up. And the big thing is that with comparatively small number of subsystem manufacturers, BAE and FLIR do most of this stuff in the US, BAE being probably a little bit more prolific for US-based cores, for fairly advanced Chinese cores, all coming either from Guide or from iRay, is not a huge amount of difference from a standpoint of imaging performance. Most of them are working fairly well. So Pulsar is different, and I've been trying to get my hands on a couple of Pulsars for a little while, and not successfully, right? So I chatted with the guy, he's super friendly and all that, and then I tried to borrow something, and everybody just disappears. So I don't know what's up with that. Pulsar uses different cores from Europe, from a French company. So I was hoping to see that. I've seen the military stuff, which is quite good, but I haven't spent any real time with the commercial stuff. But Pulsar has been doing it for a while, and it looked pretty good. So I honestly don't know. I'm almost tempted to say, deal with companies that give you good support, right? So I don't know if there's anybody there to avoid. I'm sure there is somebody out there, but I haven't gotten to them yet. Okay. What thermals would you recommend as a helmet mount companion for a PVS-14? As a companion. So PVS-14 has a 40-degree field of view. So if you're trying to figure it out as a companion, you probably want to try to get a matching field of view. And I'm not 100% sure what that would be. I really like this micro as a helmet mount, but the field of view is not going to match. With Envision, the Nox series, I actually very light and work quite nicely as binoculars or helmet mounting things. I think Nox 18 is the widest field of view, and I'm trying to figure out what the field of view is. So the diagonal is 30 degrees, not quite 40. So try to find something that's lightweight and has a wide field of view. I've played with the Envision Nox 18. I thought it was quite good. There may be others out there, but I haven't spent a ton of time with that. So this is not something I can easily tell you offhand. But start with Nox 18 from Envision and see if you can find something similar along those lines. All right, guys. It's been an hour and 45 minutes. We need to be wrapping this thing up. I'll take the last couple of questions if you have anything, and then we'll call it quits for the night. Lay it on me. Okay. It sounds like we are beginning to wrap up here, guys. Entry-level clip-on. Honestly, that's sort of what I use. So Burris BTC 50 is right around 3K. 50 millimeter lens, so it gives me reasonable distance. It's a low resolution, so 400 by 300 pixels, but it's perfectly workable, and that's the one I use. more often than not. I've spent less time with the Accufire. I like it as well, though it's a little bit heavier. But Burris BTC50 would be the first one that comes to mind as an entry-level clip-on. And Accufire should be on the list as well, although the Burris Accufire is a 35mm lens, BTC50. Burris has 35 and 50mm lens, and since clip-ons are more for targeting, I prefer the longer lens, so BTC50 would probably be my recommendation for a starter clip-on. Off topic, Benny, let's talk about cameras replacing spotters. I've thought about it, actually. So the guys at Accufire, I need to reach out to them and see. They were planning to introduce essentially digital spotter. It was supposed to be available around this summer. I haven't checked. There is a lot to be said about that, because potentially you can get very good distance in a fairly compact package, more compact than traditional spotters. And if it's a proper electro-optic device, you can do Bluetooth things with it. You can do all sorts of fun stuff with it. So I don't know if it's going to replace it across the board, but I think it will add to the functionality that spotters have. So it is an interesting topic. I was not planning to do anything dedicated to it, but you know what? Let me dig around a little bit. If there is enough activity on that, maybe it's worthwhile. In practical terms, I mean, any camera with a long lens is essentially a spotter, and oftentimes at the range and other places, I will do exactly that. Have some sort of a camera with a long lens and adequate low light performance, and use that as a spotter, so that I can also take images, explore them, zoom in, look at them afterwards, that kind of stuff. So it's not necessarily a bad idea. And from an actual usage standpoint, when out in the field, I barely use spotters at all. I tend to use binoculars. I have very nice 10 power and 15 power binoculars, and I barely use spotters. So I've been thinking about digital spotters when I looked at the device that Accufire was making. Let me see. They should have it on their website. Let me see if I can pull that up. Last time I visited them, they had a prototype there, and I looked at it. There were a couple of bugs I needed to fix, but it looked really, really nicely promising. And here we go. It's on their webpage. Let's see if it's available already. Omnis spotting scope. Let me see what they have, and I'm gonna show you the page since there was a question. So, fair general disclaimer, I have not seen the production version of this thing. This is what it looks like. Fairly long lens, but it's a much smaller lens than conventional spotters, right? And there is a basic screen in the back. I don't know how I feel about that. I would probably prefer something that's more of an eyepiece for bright light conditions and all that. But so far, I mean, from what I've seen, Accufire does a pretty nice job of packaging electronics. Everything works. The same magnification is 30 to 120 power. They have video out. Day and night capable with illuminator. Apparently, it works adequately well. I don't know. I have not seen the production version. I need to spend a little time on it, but I'll make a note to check into it. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay. How recoil sensitive are thermals? So all of the ones I've seen tend to be rated to at least 308, sometimes 300 Win Mag recoil. But that also depends on if you're shooting a fairly heavy rifle or lightweight rifle, stuff like that. So I have not used it on anything more powerful. I have not used thermal clip-ons on anything more powerful than the 308. But so far, I have not had any recoil issues on a Q-Fix, on a compared to lightweight 308 gun. All right, I picked up a super zoom camera for pretty cheap, effective focal length of 4800 millimeter, pretty crazy. The image stabilization is awesome. No way I could handhold the spotter at similar magnification. Yeah, image stabilization is an interesting thing. I was always a little surprised. Nikon a while back made a spotter with image stabilization, and I was a little surprised it didn't proliferate as much as I thought it would, but it was quite expensive. And Nikon being Nikon, they kind of fumbled it. But stabilization is a big deal. Now, keep in mind, so most of the true super zoom cameras out there that use high resolution images and long lenses, they absolutely suck when in low light, right? And they really suffer from serious flare and glare issues that happen when you look into the light and all that sort of stuff. So conventional spotters still have their place. But if you're trying to handhold something at high magnification, yeah, stabilization is definitely a friend. But once again, if your batteries die, you're kind of screwed. A purely optical spotter is still a spotter. So there are trade-offs here, and I can argue either side of this in a reasonable comfort. All right. Last bit of this. Nobody was particularly interested in the Dark Lord of Optics logo lighters, so I'm going to finish this. This is Heel Rock Bourbon. Today, it's still my favorite bourbon. All right, gentlemen. It sounds like we are sort of running out of questions. Mr. Fireprank. Yeah, I noticed that, but the weight size advantage is what made me think about swapping. Camera in question is less than a pound. Yeah, you have a small compact super zoom. In good light, it'll work surprisingly well. But in fading light and other things, a spotter still has advantages. Also, keep in mind that there's always a trade-off between magnification and field of view. So in most stations I found myself in, I wasn't willing to trade that much field of view, but it depends on where you are, what you do. So once again, I can argue both sides of this argument. Right, gentlemen, I think I'm going to call it a night. My voice is kind of beginning to go a little bit. So I'm going to call it a night and go pretend that it's early enough to eat dinner. Otherwise, I might lose weight or something. Thank you all for sticking with me for, Lord's, almost 2 hours. I hope all this techno gibberish makes some sort of sense for you. I'm trying to keep it simple, but doesn't always work. If you have any questions, please post in a comment or join me on my locals website, darklordofoptics.com. That's where I spend most of my time. That's what gets most of my attention. Thank you all, and good night.